move into that. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to Belgrade, and thank you, Misha, for organizing this talk at Matica Srpska, hope I pronounced that right, an institution that I know was founded in what is now Budapest, which seems apropos in many ways, especially given what I'm about to talk about. I have actually been meaning to visit Serbia for a long time, but I've been putting it off. But I can't really put it off anymore. Why? Because this book has been published a few weeks ago, and the title is, obviously, The Collapse of Global Liberalism. And this talk, as Misha said, is the first talk I've given on the book publicly, and that choice is very deliberate. So why, you'd ask? I mean, this isn't a book about Serbia. I'm not an expert on Serbia, and anything I get wrong about Serbia in what follows, I fully take responsibility for. I looked through the book, and Serbia is only mentioned once. It's mentioned in a discussion of why the Western liberals soured on the Yeltsin government in Russia. The part of the book that concentrates on history, recent history in the book, is mainly focused on the rise of illiberalism in the major non-liberal powers of today, which are Russia and China. I'm not saying they're the only powers. I'm not saying they're the most, but they are the most. They're the most prominent and the most important, and they're the ones that are mainly shaping the way that the world is moving. Yeah, the events in Serbia in the 1990s are key to understanding the collapse of liberalism globally. I would imagine this is very well understood here in Belgrade, where NATO bombs fell just 15 years ago. I think it's also widely understood in Moscow and in Beijing. The NATO intervention in Serbia was the use of a defensive organization set up to counter the Soviet military threat during the Cold War in an offensive manner after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. This is another way of saying that the bombing of Belgrade was the moment that NATO transitioned from being a passive geostrategic defense organization to being an active arm of liberal ideological dissemination. How self-conscious was this turn on the part of NATO and its sister organizations? The more I investigated, the more I conclude that it was actually quite self-conscious, and that this transition from a geostrategic defensive organization to an active arm of liberal ideological dissemination began very early on after the fall of communism. We must understand this to understand where we are today, faced with a lost war in Ukraine on the part of the West and the increasingly obvious collapse of the Western liberal project globally. So to my mind, one of the most interesting early indications of this new posture on the part of NATO was the American writer Susan Sontag's association with Bosnia. No one would describe Sontag as a genius. Tom Wolfe once quipped that Sontag was, quote, just another scribbler who spent her life signing up for protest meetings and lumbering to the podium encumbered by her prose style, which had a handicap parking sticker valid at the Partisan Review, end quote. Even the more creative writers on the left saw through Sontag's act quite quickly, with Camille Paglia writing that she had, quote, become synonymous with a shallow kind of hip posturing, end quote. Sontag was popular with a specific type of baby boomer liberal who was fascinated with pseudo-transgressive theatrics. These people were a little too highbrow for Woodstock, but nevertheless built their entire identity on their attendance at protests opposing the Vietnam War in the 1960s. Sontag's was the radicalism of the art gallery, not of the workers' movement. She famously called America the, quote, culmination of Western white civilization, something us Europeans might dispute, and dismissed it as a cancer, while at the same time equating Soviet communism with fascism, showing, if nothing else, Sontag's extremely limited grasp of 20th century political categories. When Sontag turned up in Bosnia in 1993, she did so to put on a play. I'm sure this is well known here, but it might not be for the Westerners listening. True to her pseudo-radical art gallery roots, she chose Samuel Beckett's tedious Waiting for Godot. In choosing this play, Sontag was deploying what she had no doubt thought was clever metaphor. Waiting for an American intervention in Bosnia was, according to Sontag, like waiting for Godot. No doubt this captured the strange trajectory of the liberal baby boomer elites in America, from being opponents of the Vietnam War to being partisans of the American global liberal empire that emerged at the end of the Cold War. But the question remains, why were Sontag and her ilk so interested in Bosnia? In 1995, Sontag gave an interview to Charlie Rose about her engagement with the country. After watching it, I come away with little beyond confirmation of the wisdom that it is people whose confidence far outstrips their ability that are the easiest to manipulate. Sontag appears to have travelled to Bosnia, listened to one side of the conflict, and concluded that the other side was not just wrong, but evil. That is, Sontag was a willing participant in what any mildly educated person could recognise as war propaganda. Sontag is quick to portray the other side, whom she appears to have no familiarity with, as having committed all sorts of war crimes. But as anybody who is not an idiot knows, in wartime, to paraphrase Lavrenti Beria, show me an enemy and I will show you the war crime. Sontag never really explains why she was attracted to one side over the other because, bless her, I do not think she has sufficient self-understanding to analyse the position she has taken. Some of what she says in the interview seems to suggest that some people in her social circle, in the arts world, were pro-Bosnian and she got sucked in from there. This is the only explanation she really provides in the entire interview. It's about 20 minutes. But without further investigation, I guess I can't really confirm if this is the main driver of her support. What is interesting in the interview is that although she does call for American and NATO military intervention, remember this is in 1995, she stops short of calling for the bombing of cities. She says that she is opposed to the bombing of Belgrade and would prefer to see NATO planes run sorties against Serbian military assets outside of the major cities. This stance did not last long. In a poorly written and borderline incomprehensible essay, in this essay Sontag uses the term geographyless, without irony, that's one word. This was published in the New York Times in May 1999. Sontag chastises those on both the right and the left for opposing the bombing of Belgrade, for not recognising that Europe was facing quote-unquote radical evil. Sontag's essay was written against the backdrop of a statement made by the US Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, that 100,000 military-aged men were missing in Kosovo and, quote, may have been murdered. In response to this, a leading expert on former Yugoslavia, Professor Robert Hayden, gave an interview to the Boston Globe, I should say, saying that these claims were nonsense and propaganda, an assessment that later turned out to be true. But what Professor Hayden says about Sontag in a subsequent, more detailed interview is particularly revealing. This is Professor Hayden. Again, we have the moral crusaders. Susan Sontag writes drivel in today's New York Times. These are crusaders. They're a bunch of righteous people. They're not evil, just blind. The genocide argument appears everywhere. The timing of articles by Susan Sontag and Daniel Goldhagen is very important. Now that Serb civilians are being killed, an argument is being made that the Western public should not be troubled by their deaths. After all, they're willing executioners, not Serb civilians, end quote. An accurate assessment. But again, we are brought back to the question, why? Why Bosnia? What was it about Bosnia that launched liberals into a moral crusade in the 1990s? Can this really be explained by the cause catching on randomly in a few pseudo-radical circles in New York City and then becoming an obsession? Perhaps, and here is where we are starting to approach my recently published book, it has something to do with the nature of liberalism itself. But we won't approach the book directly quite yet. First, we need to better understand the liberal approach to illiberal elements in Europe. It is here, I think, that we will find the true cause of Sontag and her art house friends intervening to support the bombing of Belgrade. Here I want to turn to an interesting television series called Fall of Eagles that I've recently become fascinated with after I found it is available to watch for free on YouTube, and I'd actually encourage people to watch it, Fall of Eagles. This television show is a perfect distillation of the Whig history of the region here that dominates the Western liberal mind, consciously and unconsciously. Fall of Eagles is a 13-part British television drama that was aired on BBC in 1974. The series focuses on the events that took place in this region, specifically related to the monarchies of Austria-Hungary, Germany and Russia, between the 1848 revolution and the end of the First World War in 1918. That is, it is a series about the collapse of this entire region, which, I think is widely held in sophisticated conservative circles, led to the collapse of Europe more generally over the course of the 20th century. I can assure you this is not how the series views the events of that period, however. Although the drama is of the highest quality, the embedded liberal propaganda is absolutely shocking. But I think it's quite interesting to think through. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy is treated the most gently of the three. This is because it is not hard for the screenwriters to find characters within the monarchy that could be promoted to reflect the writer's own liberal sentiments. They concentrated their liberal energies on the figure of Empress Elizabeth and focused particularly on her championing of the Hungarian cause after the 1848 revolution. As something of an unofficial Tiszteletbeli consul, or honorary consul of the great Magyar nation, it is far from my heart to question an empress that is so much revered in Hungary. But the fascination of the part of the English screenwriters has very little to do with the country of Hungary itself. Empress Elizabeth's sympathies toward the Hungarian cause is not really of interest to the writers, qua the Hungarian cause. Rather, it is viewed through the lens of the promotion of the dual monarchy being popular among right-minded liberals at the time. It is hard not to see here shades of Susan Sontag. A nation is as interesting as it is capable of acting as a mirror to reflect back onto the liberal their own narcissistic tendencies. The bad guys in Austria are the conservatives, who we are led to think oppose all progress. The Empress's husband, Franz Joseph, is portrayed in this way, although he is mostly viewed as a naive and pliable man who is taken advantage of by the nefarious conservatives in his court. It is this nefarious cabal of conservatives who are condemned in the series. At the end of the episode, on the suicide pact between Empress Elizabeth's liberal son, the Crown Prince of Rudolf, and Baroness Marie Vetsera, popularly known as the Mayerling incident, a prominent member of this evil cabal, Edward von Taft, seemed to celebrate the incident, noting, quote, "The Crown Prince has destroyed his own character and the liberal cause with it," end quote. Germany gets a rougher treatment than Austria-Hungary, but finds salvation in an interesting place. The early storyline focuses on Kaiser Friedrich II and his conservative, or Friedrich III, I should say, and his conservative Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The conservative views of these two men are contrasted with the supposedly enlightened liberal views of the Emperor's English wife, Empress Victoria, who transmits her liberal ideas to her son Wilhelm I. But by the time their grandson Kaiser Wilhelm II comes on the scene, he is made Kaiser, as you all probably know, after his father dies in the same year as his grandfather, the writers pivot to portraying Bismarck as being a stodgy, safe pair of hands, in contrast to Wilhelm's wild-eyed fanaticism. Yet the writers are careful to make the case that Wilhelm's aggressiveness is due to the influence exercised over him by conservatives like Bismarck, and are not a result of his upbringing by his liberal parents. Now, perhaps I'm naive, but I read Wilhelm II's desire for a German empire and the militarism that came with it as being an attempt to copy the foreign policies of the British Empire, the first of the liberal global empires. Perhaps someday an honest historian can give a true account of the intellectual influences that inspired the militaristic leaders of the European countries at the beginning of the First World War. I don't think that those influences are what many people think they were. I think it was probably liberal influence. What is so fascinating about the portrayal of Germany in the series is that it takes for granted that the British war propaganda about the Germans in the First World War was all true. When I looked into the background of most of the writers for the series, there were more than a few obvious political liberals and leftists, including one Trotskyist. But the script that portrayed Kaiser Wilhelm II was handed to John Elliot, a former employee in the Public Relations Directorate at the War Office after the Second World War, who would go on to produce films profiling the rise of American air power. Just as when Sontag uses her public platform to call in American air power, liberals tasked with portraying the recent history of Central Europe have no problem parroting the propaganda of a war that is as much reviled as the First World War. There really is something about this region that disturbs the liberal mind and moves it to action. When the writers get their hands on Russia, the propaganda starts to become truly farcical. The scripts on Austria-Hungary and Germany are at least somewhat subtle, but the script on Russia has members of the Tsar's court who outwardly talk about how backwards the peasantry are, how Russia is not a European country, and how absolute monarchy is the only system of government standing between civilization and anarchy in the country. The writers take the side of the radicals. Lenin gets a sympathetic portrayal, of course, Trotsky even more. They are at pains to portray the revolution that would engulf the country as being inevitable because the Russian elite were insufficiently liberal, and not a contingent outcome of the social pressures put on the country by the First World War. The portrayal of the Russian Orthodox Church is particularly amusing. It seems to be lifted straight out of Bolshevik propaganda of the period. The Russian Orthodox Church is not simply portrayed as a key base of support for the Tsarist state, but rather an actual arm of the state itself. In one scene, a character describes how Orthodox priests are agents of the Tsar and use the confessional to collect intelligence on dissidents. The writer did not seem to pause to question whether enemies of the Tsarist state, mostly Marxists and anarchists who were violently hostile to Christianity, would be likely to make use of the seal of confessional in an Orthodox church to confess their crimes and plots against the crown. As someone who grew up in the English-speaking West, I do not think that the narrative put forward in Fall of Eagles is particularly idiosyncratic from a Western perspective. Most of the population in the West, even the educated population, have no real sense of Central and Eastern Europe or the Balkans, especially not prior to the Second World War. To the extent that the intelligentsia have any conception of the region, it roughly aligns with what is portrayed in this television series, a region prone to dangerous illiberalism, without constant Western liberal monitoring is the natural equilibrium of this region. Beyond anything else, I think this explains why Western liberals were so keen to intervene militarily in the region in the 1990s. It was not that they really cared about the Bosnians or any other ethnic group for that matter. It was that they saw their job as ensuring that the region remained as liberal as possible and that any illiberal forces from within the region did not spread to the West. So now, I think we can come to the book. The basic claim of the book is that liberalism is now in the process of collapse. This is a big claim, I know. I trace the roots of liberalism to the English Civil War and John Locke's two treatises on government. If I'm correct, this is the collapse of a project that is around half a millennium old. It is, by my account anyway, collapsing because the whole project is highly ideological, unnatural to human beings, and is plagued with contradictions. It has only taken so long to collapse because until the rise of what I call hyperliberalism in the 1990s, it was never really tried before because liberal tendencies in Western societies were scattered and dispersed, propped up on the back of non-liberal, mostly Christian ideas and social structures. These pre-liberal ideas and social structures started being liquidated in the 1990s, which resulted in the beginning of the collapse of liberalism only 3 decades later. The collapse has been precipitated not just by social decay that liberal ideas cause, but also by the overextension of these ideas themselves. The attempts to spread the liberal gospel abroad, often by force, have fed into the domestic social decay and accelerated the process of global liberal collapse. The more aggressive attempts to spread liberalism started in the city where I'm currently standing and are now at work in the trenches of the Donbass. This is why I think it is so important to address the question of Serbia and the region more generally, which I've not done in the book. Hopefully that shortcoming has now been somewhat remedied. What is liberalism? I give an almost structuralist account of liberal ideology in the book. I'm an economist after all, and we economists like stripped-down models that can provide as much explanatory power as possible with a minimum amount of articulation. By my account, liberal ideology has 2 broad components: equality and competition. Let's start with equality. By equality, I do not mean something like equality before the law. The concept of equality before the law is not liberal. In his Politics, for example, Aristotle wrote, quote, "The only stable source is one in which all men are equal before the law," end quote. Needless to say, Aristotle was not a liberal. By equality, I mean something more like equivalence, that is, rendering of things equivalent. Perhaps an economic example is the best way to explain this. Gold and silver are fundamentally different substances. Yet we humans have a habit of trying to establish equivalences between gold and silver. So we might say 1 gold coin is worth 2 silver coins. The first move of liberalism is to try to render everything equivalent. Ideas must be equivalent, people must be equivalent, cultures must be equivalent, everything. This is another way of saying that liberalism's first move is to try to demolish all hierarchies that it sees as arbitrary. Liberals hate hierarchies. When I say that Western liberals view Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans region as being illiberal, I mean that they view this region as tending to form hierarchies of various kinds, whether in their governments, amongst ethnic groups, amongst languages, and so on. What is needed, according to liberals, is a hefty dose of equality, even if it must be dropped from a bomb bay. In liberalism, equivalences or equalities are established through contracts. Liberals love contracts as much as they hate hierarchies. Contract. At a micro level, contracts can be used for anything from economic relationships to gender reassignment. In liberal societies, contracts seem to proliferate endlessly in a process we might call contract inflation. All normal human relationships, which liberals view as arbitrary and hierarchical, are gradually replaced with contractual relationships. Conservatives bemoan liberal attacks on the family, for example, but what they are really trying to do is replace these natural hierarchies with contracts. The second move of liberalism is competition. This is what distinguishes liberals from their Marxist cousins. Liberals hold to a very dogmatic notion of progress. It is basically their reason for existing. They are conduits of progress, or at least that's how they think of themselves. Progress in liberalism is achieved through competition. Equality or equivalence renders everything equivalent. People's ideas, everything are reduced to identical atoms. These atoms are then allowed to enter into competition with one another. Superior atoms float to the top, inferior atoms sink to the bottom. The resulting hierarchy is non-arbitrary in the minds of liberals because it is based on the competitive process. The perfect hierarchy is never achieved in liberalism. Rather, perfection is always in the process of becoming. The view is implicitly Hegelian. But despite perfection never being reached, if equality is established, arbitrary hierarchies are demolished, and competition is given free rein, at any given moment in time, we will always be living in the best of all possible worlds, according to liberals. Understand these basic concepts, and I think you will understand the essence of the liberal project. Understand the essence of the liberal project, and you will, for the most part, be able to decode the behaviour of liberals. Sontag went to Bosnia because in her mind it was at risk of having arbitrary hierarchies imposed on it. She thought that a few bombs dropped on Belgrade would demolish these emerging hierarchies, and the resulting equality that was established in the region would give rise to a harmonious process of constructive national competition. All the problems we see in the region between 1848 and 1918, according to the writers of Fall of Eagles, are due to stuffy conservatives clinging to their arbitrary hierarchies, especially the outdated monarchies. Monarchies have been the villains of the liberal narrative since it was founded, something obvious when we consider that the first of Locke's two treatises is an extended critique of the divine right of kings, and even more obvious in the fact that the English Civil War resulted in King Charles I having his head removed from his body. The problem, however, is that the liberals are wrong. The world simply does not work like that. The natural law is real, and the world is built on hierarchies at every level. These hierarchies are natural, and we as human beings can either try to conform to them and lead happy, peaceful lives, or we can try and rebel against them and create chaos. When the liberals have their way, chaos necessarily results. The amount of chaos that results is directly proportional to the extent to which liberals are allowed to have their way, because liberal ideas are so unnatural. The immune systems in our societies tend to try and impose constraints on the spread of these ideas. For most of the last 500 years, we have more or less managed to keep these dangerous and destructive ideas in check, but since the end of the Cold War, they have run amok. This is where we stand today. The liberal cat has finally clawed its way out of the bag and is now attacking the neighbours. We look around us and all we see is chaos. Chaos in the culture, chaos in our economies, chaos in international relations. Chaos inevitably leads to death, and we see plenty of death around us too. In Tarkovsky's classic film Stalker, there is a room where people go to have their deepest desires fulfilled. But any time anyone actually goes into the room, tragedy results because people tend to misunderstand what they actually want. This is what has happened with the liberals today. They finally got their way and imposed liberal ideas on our societies almost completely, and they are baffled and frightened by the chaos that has resulted. This is why I think liberalism is starting to collapse. It is starting to collapse precisely because its aims have finally been realised. After 500 years of trying, the liberals have finally been given the opportunity to test their hypotheses, as it were, and the results have been absolutely catastrophic. The results are so catastrophic, in fact, that many liberals are having a hard time defending their ideas anymore. I challenge anyone in this room to name a liberal thinker under the age of 50 of the quality of a Rawls, a Fukuyama, or even a Habermas. There are none. There are only critics. The field of liberalism has collapsed into ridiculous Soviet-like government or NGO-sponsored pseudo-disciplines like illiberal studies, where mediocre liberal thinkers gawk at the critics of liberalism like zoo animals. Sometimes it appears with a view to highlighting them to the authorities. It is embarrassing. When those bombs fell on Belgrade just over 15 years ago, the liberalism script was already written. Liberalism had already been unleashed on the world, and the consequences that were going to result were all but inevitable. When you replace a master strategist like George Kennan with a gullible charlatan like Susan Sontag and give them influence over the military apparatus, what on earth do you think is going to happen? Well, here we are. We are not quite standing amidst the ashes of liberalism because it is still in the process of burning down. I only hope that we can build something better after the fire burns out. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you very much, especially with emphasizing the meaning of our space in the global history. We have some of these famous plays here about the role of the Serbia or role of the region in the general global movements, and we even got used to that everything started from us. You remember Bill Clinton, like the First World War started in Belgrade, in Yugoslavia and the Balkans. The Second World War somehow also started here 2 years after it really started. But anyway, he said, well, the third world also might start here. Hopefully, for the time being, still hasn't there, but definitely we had something about, 90s and 99. And thank you very much for emphasizing this. Before I open the debate, which I'm very sure it's going to be interesting and useful exchange for all of us, just let me mention two things. First, the book is really full of everything. I managed to read, actually, I got PDF 3 days ago. I think coming from Berlin, I managed to read the first 100 pages and just to briefly pass it over. And I really have to recommend it strongly because it's very concise and very precise. Philip is not entering into deep elaboration of the history of liberalism whatsoever. It's really reduced to the basic argument, but it's very understandable and very focused, and that's how you get the basis from which he goes on with understanding what is happening with China, with Russia, their beautiful thoughts upon that, and leading to the end shortly again displaying where are the problems, from where do we see the chaos actually, from I don't know, bureaucracy to economy, technology, society, and so on and so on. And he emphasized actually that he's not trying to define how this world's going to look, which is probably impossible at this moment. But he's trying to open the space for and to show the first incentives or hints of how actually this transitional period is going to look like, and we are seeing some of that. Two things that I will just add as a comments, and maybe because there are a lot of people who had been dealing with the political theory or economic theory and liberal tradition from very different sides. Philip is emphasizing actually that the history of liberalism, for example, for the last 200 years has been so broad and diversified that you could find all the different tendencies, even controversial ones, within the history of the liberalism. But actually, what I wanted to emphasize that in a way, with liberalism, like with the Christianity, you could have either a position on pure normativity, which is based on the scripture and understanding what is it, and he's trying to define something which is metaphysics of liberalism, returning to the basic ideas. Or on the other hand, you could say what we call predanje in Serbian, which is inheritance in a broad sense, and actually that Christianity is not only what is being inscribed in the book, but that actually that everything that has happened during the next 2000 years is defining what really Christianity has been. The same is with liberalism. And he's giving some fantastic parabolas actually how if you put liberal from 80-20 into contemporary day at, I don't know, green left or whatever, convention or democratic convention in America, he would be horrified to see what they see actually as a liberalism, and vice versa. Actually, for them, he would be fascist or, I don't know, conservatives, misogynic, name it, whatever we know from our beautiful, brave new world, and so on. What for sure is, and I will finish with that, is one of my favorite economists and thinkers, Wilhelm Röpke, actually, whose the best book is called Jenseits von Angeboten und Nachfrage, meaning it was translated as a human economy. You can find it in Chicago in 55, I think they translated. But literally what he intended to say is actually in German original is much better because it says on the other side of demand and supply. And actually the basic argument says, yes, demand and supply and the market forces are important. They have managed to help us quite a lot. But they are very much depending on the things that liberalism doesn't have or the market cannot produce by itself. And these are religion, tradition, rule of law, family, community, and everything like that. And the point that Philip is actually emphasizing that whatever you may define that liberalism is, metaphysics or the tradition of that, now we have entered into the world which has been stripped of those beyond market and supply, and that has been really reduced to the sum of the basic fundamentalistic approaches like this one in liberal international understanding of Bosnia and humanitarian intervention, and it is really producing the chaos. Out of that, some people say we should restore those things that were erased by the liberal and return to some kind of balance. And some other people say it's not possible today. And we could see what China has been doing, which has accepted all the kind of modernization, but strongly avoiding actual liberal incentives to accept democracy and any kind of liberal order and so on. So really, it is bringing us to the plenty of open questions and plenty of open issues that I think Philip has been brilliantly defined and especially brilliantly presented how we actually came into this world. So with this, I will finish and open the floor. By the way, technically, should we move the recorder or not? We can understand you. But Nikola Tutsakos, please.
First of all, I apologize if my accent sounds like that in the Saturnac, so I will take up what Misha just said about liberalism in practice. While listening to a very edifying lecture, I sort of wondered, when we talk about these illiberal powers rising, what I find sort of problematic is that they are precisely liberal in certain key areas. Mm-hmm. We mentioned political economy, but didn't get into it. Are they not crucially liberal in terms of political economy, in terms of participating in global markets, in terms of not instituting certain new economic forms, not doing state allocation of resources? We lack a coherent or illiberal economic project like we had during the Cold War. And in that sense, I wonder, are they not simply non-democratic, maybe, rather than illiberal? Because this liberal point, this market competition, this drive for profit, the profit motive, is what I find to be at the core of liberalism. And in that sense, do you predict that we should expect more state-run enterprises, more state allocation of resources? Would that be a coherent economic challenge to liberalism? Because when I think of liberalism nowadays, I of course think of neoliberalism, I think of the Austrian school, I think of Mises, and I think they would see modern China as their great strength. I think they would be delighted at how privatization occurred in Russia, and how privatization occurred here. In all the ex-Soviet and ex-Yugoslav countries. So I'm sort of wondering, what is precisely illiberal in terms of economics that we should expect after this fall of liberal order? Or should we, in fact, expect more economic liberalism, but rather less democracy and liberalism in the sense of political liberalism, in the sense of internal politics, of freedom, emancipation, and so on and so on?
So, good question. Very good question. And there's two tracks to answer it on. First of all, I wouldn't say that the Chinese economy is actually neoliberal in a sense. The way that the Chinese economy works, I'm quite a specialist on the Chinese economy. I spent quite a long time studying it. The way it works is basically that the almost borderline Austrian, as you said, market forces are allowed to operate at a micro level. And if you go to China, if you guys in Beijing a few weeks ago, it's very visible. It's like a market bazaar or something like that. It's crazy. You can bargain on almost anything, really. I mean, not quite, but you know, it is kind of market bazaar like, and it's kind of fun actually, I have to say. As a former finance guy, it's kind of fun. But on top of that, the way that resources are end allocated, the investment, that's allocated by the state. Almost completely. I mean, like, if you want to, just to give an example, they're trying to get their semiconductor industry off the ground now that they're having problems with the Americans on it. They set up a thing called the Big Fund, which is a massive investment fund, and they plow money into the space. Now, what they're doing is some combination of it's very similar to what in the 1930s these people were talking about market socialism. They were actually arguing with the Austrians about it. It's very similar to that. They throw money at a competitive space. They let market competition processes give rise to the best of the best, and it comes out. But overall, I'd say the Chinese model, the investment's basically allocated by the state or by quasi-state institutions, like a fairly tightly controlled banking system. The entire monetary system is pretty tightly controlled. There's no capital flows externally or so on. I mean, to my mind, I'm kind of a Keynesian economist, and what Keynes is writing about, you can go and actually read it in the foreword to the German edition of the General Theory of Interest. That's the most clear articulation. He's addressing the National Socialists, but we won't even go into it. But that's where he articulates his plan for the future economy. And basically he's talking about what the French used to call de-regime, but like a really sophisticated version of it where state allocates most of resources. I think China's basically engaged in that right now. And I think since the beginning of the war, Russia's moving in that direction too. And I think that's probably the future of functional economies. There's a lot of, I mean, we could talk about the economics of that all day. Second track of it is that is, by the way, some of that's discussed on the Chinese economy in the book quite extensively. The other thing is minorly discussed in the book, but I think it's something that we need to think about a lot more, is the question of all this economics and market economics and stuff itself. I previously wrote a book a long time ago when I was much younger called The Reformation of Economics, which was about economic theory and the development of economic theory and so on. And what's really striking is that this is a broader thing, that liberal theorists come in and they take ideas, and Dan will know this, they take ideas from various sources, they call them liberal ideas, and then they say, if you disagree with that, you're a liberal. So I gave the example in the talk of the equality before the law. Equality before the law existed in Aristotle, it existed for citizens in Roman law. Of course, and like I don't know how the Chinese legal system worked in Confucian times, but I bet there was equality before the law, because if there's not equality before the law, you get riots, okay? Like, this is the easiest way to create a riot and social upheaval, is denying people equality before the law. Like, it's obvious. So they take all these kind of common sense ideas and they call them liberal ideas. And I think they've basically done this with a lot of this market process stuff. So, for example, a lot of the Austrians highlight this, but I don't think they know what they're doing when they highlight it. But a lot of the initial discussions of how market economies should operate are by the Salamanca School of Economics. And the Salamanca School are counter-Reformation Catholic thinkers. Basically, what's happened is the Protestants, the Lutherans, and so on have come in and they've highlighted that some of the economic restrictions that the church still has in place from the medieval period around the regulation of guilds and usury are no longer really fit for purpose. And the Salamanca School open their minds a little bit to what we'd call market forces, exchange, and so on. And they come to many of the same conclusions, and they say, well, this isn't heretical or anything, it's fine. And they actually articulate a lot of the kind of Adam Smith style theories in minor form. And you'll go back, the Austrians actually highlight this best. I don't know what they think they're actually arguing. They do so, but they highlight that the Catholic theologians could come to these conclusions, and they're coming to these conclusions simply because it's put in almost Marxist terms. There's an evolution from feudalism turning into some sort of mercantile capitalism, and the thinking needs to catch up. Like the Catholic structures work perfectly well for a feudal society. There was nothing wrong with them. And then the society develops as markets open up. We're moving into the Renaissance period, the Reformation period, and all these thinkers like go, okay, well, we have to adjust our ideas now. And then the liberals come along 150 years later, steal them, and say you were all idiots. They do this constantly. So the reason I'm saying that is because if and when we think through what a post-liberal future and so on is going to look like, in economics, for example, and this will be in law, this will be in philosophy, this will be in everything, but in economics, just to take my field as an example, we really have to look at these things and say, okay, well, what aspects of this are actually just common sense, and what aspects of this are hardcore liberal ideology? Because the liberals also have a tendency to take ideas like, for example, market exchange, which is quite a reasonable idea, and quite a functional idea to my mind, for the most part, not always, and then they make it completely extreme. Like, I wrote an article recently for American Affairs where I was pointing out that OnlyFans adds to GDP. And there was a joke I took it from a joke on Twitter that somebody said, an American guy or something said, you add to GDP by hiring an OnlyFans model, but you don't when you sleep with your wife. And I'm like, okay, so there's something really fundamentally broken about that economic measure. But does that mean that GDP accounts just have to be thrown in the bin? No, you're going to have to modify them somehow. But so the liberals always take it to this extreme. They take these ideas that are like natural law based and common sense based, equality before the law, relatively free market competition in certain sectors, like we don't need state control of barbershops, okay, stuff like that. And then they turn it into an ideology and an end into itself. So I think the challenge for us is going to be to pick through the debris of liberalism, say what is actually sensible here, realize that a lot of the stuff that's sensible actually didn't have its roots in liberalism, and then we'll have to reconstruct from there. That's my sense. Sorry, long-winded answer, but it's a really interesting question.
Along these lines, Theo, you're having a brilliant reminding us, or generally everyone who's going to be reading that the most important thing, the most important book for Adam Smith was not The Wealth of Nation, according to him, but actually Theory of Moral Sentiment, which is exactly insisting on, Christianity and necessity of nurturing the morality and the moral values as a basis for everything else. But as we all know, in the last 100 years, this other part has been completely neglected, and this one mostly very stupid, or the way it is interpreted today, the famous one about the bakers, blah blah blah. They are doing that not because they are like us, because they think it's just generally. Sorry for I will interrupt, but actually it's really fantastic. It's 800 pages book, and they get 2 quotes out of that and make the whole ideology a metaphysic, which is really horrible, and speaks a lot about the world in which we are living,
But I don't think we should defend Adam Smith, because he does, I call that soft liberalism in the book, where you come along and you basically put forward ideas that aren't novel. and you say, hey, we should engage in a little bit of exchange, and the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker should all exchange, and then you like temper them with, as you say, the theory of moral sentiments, like common sense approach, kind of Scottish Enlightenment stuff. But the end result is always the same. It's like you can't really have your cake and eat it. Do you want to be a common sense natural law person who like the School of Salamanca, like looks at what's functional in that, or do you want to say, no, I'm fundamentally different from that. I'm a liberal, but I want all of this non-liberal stuff like to undergird my entire ideology. And so that's why I think it's dead. We're not going to go back, like we're not going to return to the common sense of Scottish Enlightenment. Scottish Enlightenment's not coming back. It's like it didn't work. You can't have your cake and eat it. So no, I totally agree with everything you're saying, but like I don't think we should give a lot of these people like a free pass. Like I always put it this way, like look at 19th century British liberalism. For every person that you have that's an exponent of it, that's very reasonable and common sense, and here's why you should have a family, and here's why you should adhere to Victorian moral Protestant values, there's the follower of John Stuart Mill, who's by any account a complete cultural radical, right? And like, but the person who's advocating for the sensible approach, they can't actually argue intellectually against John Stuart Mill's ideas on its own terms, right? Because they're liberals. So I think the whole thing is just, we've got to the point now where we've tried it comprehensively in Western societies, and the results are so freakish that that's it. That was a bad idea. We finally tried it. You guys have been asking us to try it in purified form for 500 years. You got your wish, and you collapsed all the societies it touched. Okay, time to move on, right?